Okay, so we're live in room and over the etherwebs. Welcome to the Environmental Speaker Series. My name is Stefan Freeland, and as usual, we're both in person on campus and broadcasting live. And to welcome today's speaker, I'd like to welcome Natalie Beloy of the Salish Sea Institute. So Natalie.
Thank you. Thanks everyone, and thanks for being here. It's been really fun to coordinate the Winter Salish Sea series for the College of the Environment series this year and years past. And part of living in the Salish Sea region right now is living across the US-Canada border. And our guest today is joining us from Vancouver Island. And I'm really delighted to host this guest and to hear about his experiences. So I'll just be sharing his bio, and then afterward I'll be collecting questions from here in the room and on Zoom. So the title today is Natsamak, We Are All One. And our speaker is John Harris, an Indigenous educator from the Nanaimo First Nation in Canada, working in the Greater Victoria School District's Indigenous Education Department as the Elders and Indigenous Knowledge Facilitator, as well as on UVic's Living Lab Project Steering Committee, and who works as a program coordinator and facilitator. John is passionate about weaving local Indigenous perspectives and knowledge into teaching and learning opportunities for youth. And as an educator, John has found that incredibly profound learning occurs at the intersection between traditional ecological knowledge of local First Peoples, land-based and Indigenous pedagogy, and an individual and collective openness to embrace Squalowin, a good mind and a good heart when doing this work. So please join me in welcoming John. And John Harris, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Kwanasilum Nama, it's good to see you. Haitsapka, Kwanzalupskaki, Patana Quail. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to start by saying if there's any elders in the audience or room today, Asiem Solhuen, Asiem Nasieya, Entha John Harris, Entha Manaut John E. Dorothea Harris, Tanitsanut Snanemoch, Yawen Nasti Sitala Te Laquangan, Ilami, Inuksak, Mastimoch, Hakwishis Tana Tamaquail, Haitsapka, Kwasiyalup, Atanaquel, Ayatul, Sisiwatul, Sitalata, Laquangan, Ilami, Inuksak, Mastimoch, Nihakwishus, Tamach, Atanaquel. My name is John Harris, and I'm a member of Nanaimo First Nation, that's Nanaimo. I was born and raised in Greater Victoria and Laquangan territory, and I'm a very grateful visitor on these lands. My grandparents on my dad's side are late John and Gloria Harris. My grandpa John was Dene from Cold Lake, Alberta, Treaty 8 territory. My late grandma Gloria was Nanaimo from this territory. And on my mom's side, my grandfather is William Good. Tiskinikin is traditional name from the hereditary chief family of our nation, William Good, and Sandra Morehouse Good. I've worked in Indigenous education for the last 10 years. And currently as the District Elders and Indigenous Knowledge Facilitator. And as such, two key components of my role are supporting land-based education and working with elders. Introducing oneself in a good way is an important piece of protocol that establishes relationality and to the communities that we're in. When I'm in at a community event or gathering, elders will ask who my grandparents are as a way to get to know me, and we might even be related. And another important teaching that I've been taught, and one that is frequently taught by many elders in Coast Salish territory around the Salish Sea, speaks to both relationality and responsibility. And that is Natsamat, that we are all one. Natsamat reminds us, because we are all one, that we all matter equally, and collectively we make the whole. It's a teaching that applies to everything, all the trees, plants, animals, and everything around us. A tree is treated with the same respect given to a human and thanked for the use of its wood, bark, and roots. When I'm out on the land or water, fishing, clam digging, hunting or harvesting berries or cedar, Elders will say to speak to my path in Holkaminum. They'll say to speak to everything around me and to explain my intentions, that I'm only passing through or that I'm only here to take what I need. The graphic that you see on the screen, I think, is really symbolic of differing worldviews. You see the one on the left is more of a hierarchical worldview where humans are at the top of the pyramid and everything else is below. And it's interesting because the things that we do at the top of the pyramid really affect everything that goes down the pyramid, but they also affect us. You can see that the world here is represented by flags, nations, or countries. And on the right, we have a more cyclical worldview, one where humans are part of the equation, not above it. And so the things that we do in the equation affect ourselves as they affect everything in that. I just wanted to share a little bit about myself, and I could share about my credentials, my professional credentials, and my work experience, but I think what qualifies me to give this talk today is my experience growing up on the Salish Sea my entire life. I grew up, fishing and hunting and harvesting all the time. Actually, lots down in the States. I might have an auntie on this call tonight. If I do, hi, Auntie Brenda. She lives down in Washington State, and I have cousins who actually live in Bellingham there. So if you're there as well, nice to see you. I spent a lot of time down in Washington State, down near the Elwha and the rivers down there, and we would go often fishing during the salmon run, and we would go smelting during when the smelt were coming into shore. I spent lots of time fishing and hunting up here on the Salish Sea around this territory as well. Always growing up digging clams and mussels and oysters, gooseneck barnacles. Much of our diet, much of the food that we ate as kids came from what we could, produce for ourselves. And if you talk to any elders or community members who have been around for some time in these territories, they'll share stories about changes that the environment has gone through over time. And I think about a story my dad tells when he was a boy, when he would tell this to me when I was a boy. He would say, when I was your age, Sonny, I would go fishing over on the Fraser River with my dad. Our nation had a historic fishery on the Fraser. And he said, when I was your age, I used to be able to walk across the backs of the river or walk across the river on the backs of salmon. That's how plentiful they were. When you would go during the salmon run, during the sockeye run, all you would see across the entire river were the backs of salmon swimming up the river. And I know, from experience that that's no longer the case due to largely overfishing and habitat destruction. The recent landslide in the Fraser that really decimated the salmon run over the last few years has had a profound impact on the health of that river and the ecosystem around it. I spend a lot of time working with elders, and one elder in particular is a Nuu-chah-nulth elder, Mark Atleo, who I work with in this territory, and he owned a fishing boat for about 50 years. He went out and fished on the Salish Sea as a commercial fisherman. And he said over that time, he witnessed, the destruction of habitats, which really took its toll on the river systems and the salmon runs in the different areas where he was fishing. He talked about pollution and overfishing as being key contributors to, the decimation of the stock. And we think of salmon as a keystone species. The health of the salmon really reflect the health of the ecosystem. And so when we see that the salmon stocks are dwindling and the health of the salmon is deteriorating, that has big implications, not only for Indigenous communities, but all communities around the Salish Sea. I guess for me, my experience would be, when I was growing up, we would go to Esquimalt Lagoon almost 7 days a week. We literally lived there. We spent a lot of time at the beach, rain, snow, shine, winter, summer, spring, fall. We were always at the beach. And we used to light a fire, and I would go out and scoop out crabs out of the little estuary and behind the lagoon there. I would go in, just wading in up to my waist and scoop out 4 or 5 or 6 nice big Dungeness, and we would, light a fire and cook them in our camp cook pot right on the beach in ocean water is the best way to cook crab, right from the sea. And that was my experience growing up. And over time, things changed. There was a lot of eelgrass in that ecosystem at one time, and I would go wading through the eelgrass, and the crabs would just be thick in there, nice big 7-inch across, much larger than legal. And it didn't take me long to find them. But as I got older and older, I started to notice less and less, and they were getting smaller and smaller, until today, when I take my kids down to the lagoon, there's no eelgrass left, and there's no crabs in there at all. And so it made me reflect on my own experiences of the health of ecosystems and how they've changed, I would say over the last 30 years, just that one particular area, how that ecosystem has changed from, warming oceans, from ocean acidification, from pollution, from development around the area. So it made me really reflect on, one day when I get to be, in the position my dad is in, or elders who I work with, those will be the stories that I have to reflect on. And so I really am committed to ensuring, or doing my part to ensure, that those stories are being told less and less and not more and more frequently. So I just wanted to share an opposing worldview to Natsamat. And this is a quote that actually a colleague of mine who works in my office, she's a district counselor, she says this all the time, talking about non-Indigenous, or particularly maybe colonial worldview, that many people only see the value of the forest once it's been cut down. On the left, you see a picture of a clear cut in Pacheedaht territory on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Some of you may be familiar with this story that's been ongoing with, land defenders blockading logging trucks from going and clear cutting old growth in the Fairy Creek area. And on the right, you see a picture of Bill Jones, an elder from that community, from the Pacheedaht community. Just to the right of him on the picture here is Rose Henry. And Rose is actually a very close family friend. And I grew up with Rose, spending a lot of time with our family for many, many years. And so you can see that that Rose had an impact on me by the presentations that I give today, and the message and the information that I try to communicate with staff and students. Colonies and colonial governments were established with the central objective to expropriate land and extract resources. We think of numerous examples around the world, India with spices, and Africa with minerals, and Central America with sugar plantations and cotton plantations. Here in Canada is no different. The colonial government was extractive initially with furs, and then extractive with timbers and minerals and fossil fuels, and the list goes on. With this being the foundation upon which Canada is built, situations like this will continue to play out in Indigenous communities. Other examples from around this region are like the Salish Sea Dam, for example. Another is the pipeline in Wet'suwet'en territory. And I just want to qualify for anybody who hears, that I know there's a popular understanding in media that that First Nations have signed on to these projects, that they are, in support of pipelines going through their territories, or they're in support of, logging or clear cutting, or in support of damming their rivers. And I will just say that while there may be support from some groups within First Nations, that the traditional teachings that many of the elders and many of the knowledge holders express are ones that stem from ancient understandings from time immemorial, and that the political pressures and the pressures of your community being in poverty, sometimes you are, rather than agreeing to these projects or in favor of them, you're complying to potentially lift your community out of poverty, where your first concerns are housing and food security for your people. Sometimes the environment, the needs of the environment, can be tertiary. I think we all know the impacts of deforestation. Things like, especially with clear-cut logging, habitat loss, runoff, and the role of old growth trees in sustaining healthy forests. We know that the old growth actually communicate with younger trees to let them know whether it's a safe place to grow. They actually help buffer against forest fires, which we've seen more and more frequently recently. Second and third growth forests are notorious tinderboxes for massive forest fires. And one of the few barriers against that is old growth forests. And the things that we do to the forest have an impact on our waterways and oceans. When we clear cut large swaths of land like this, there's nothing left to hold the earth together. So when the heavy rains come, the top layers of soil wash into the rivers and into the ocean and deltas and estuaries, and can smother any fish that are living there or that are spawning. So they have a profound impact. I think that, when we speak about the land, we speak about the ocean as well. So I just wanted to share a clip with you. Some of you may have heard of this guy, maybe not. His name is David Suzuki. And I really like this clip because it provides a non-Indigenous perspective of First Nations worldview from Haida Gwaii. So I just need to move this toolbar out of my way here.
His name is synonymous with the environmental movement. He's been a longtime ally to Indigenous peoples.
Well, it's good to be here.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I have to girl geek out just a little bit and tell you that you are one of my biggest heroes. I used to watch your Nature Things all the time, and it's an honor to talk to you.
Well, thank you. You don't have to stop watching. We're still on air.
So tell me, when did you realize that you wanted to align yourself with Indigenous peoples and in the issues that we deal with?
Well, it started way back in the early 1980s. I didn't know anything about Indigenous people. I was like the vast majority of Canadians, completely ignorant. Now I see First Nations everywhere in Vancouver, in Toronto. You're all there, but my world, just didn't include them until I got the idea of doing a film about the battle over logging in what was then called the Queen Charlotte Islands. We now call it Haida Gwaii. I very quickly realized, as I researched it, that the Haida had thrown up a blockade and had said, "Look, that's it. No more logging in this critical part of the islands." And so I went up and got very involved in a film called Windy Bay. That was a 20-minute film about the battle. It got the biggest response from Canadians across the country of any program the Nature of Things had ever run up to that point. That was in 1981, I think. And that's when I realized there was something really important here, because I interviewed a guy at that time who was simply an artist, Gujao, who became the president of the Haida Council. And I said to him, you know, Gujao, your people are desperate for jobs, and a lot of the loggers who are cutting down the trees on the islands here are Haida. So logging is adding economic value to your community. Why are you fighting against logging? And he said, because when the trees are gone, we'll be just like everybody else. That didn't make any sense to me at the time he said it. I thought, what the heck is he talking about? Till I went back home and started looking at the rushes, and I realized he had opened a window on a radically different way of looking at the world. What that simple statement was saying is that to be Haida means to be connected to the land in a profound way. We don't end at our skin or fingertips, that it's the trees and the fish and the air and the birds. All of that is what make the Haida who they are. You cut the trees down, sure, the Haida will still be here, but then they'll be like everyone else. And that began my journey of exploration and learning, and I'm still on the journey of meeting Indigenous people, not just in Canada, but around the world.
And
I just love that that perspective that he shares in speaking with that member of the Haida Nation. That teaching reminds me of Natsamat, what the teaching and understanding that I've grown up with. And so it's nice to hear a non-Indigenous perspective of that teaching from a different territory. So I also wanted to talk about the role of elders, knowledge holders, and educators. And in all of my years in education, all of the elders I've talked to, they always, stress how important it is to start with the youth, to get the youth out involved and learning. And so much of the work that I do in education and outside of education revolves around that. And I'm so very passionate about that. Some of you may recognize these next few slides. I'm borrowing from a previous keynote that I did back in October for a conference, but they really speak to the work that we did over the summer. This summer, we worked with about 30 youth from Esquimalt, Songhees, and Pakwachin nations, 3 nations in this territory here in Greater Victoria. And part of the work that we did was being out on the land, working with elders, learning language, looking at the health of ecosystems, restoration. And so here you can see we're doing a beach seine to see what species are in the water in the gorge waterway. Here we are down at one of the elders who was connected to our program. This is actually where one of his grandfather's longhouses was once stood right here. And so we took a picture for him and sent it to him. His granddaughter was actually one of the youth involved in the program. Here we are at Pakwachin Nation looking at shellfish, and this was shortly after the heat dome. And actually, it almost looks like it's during the heat dome, as sunny and hot it was during that time. And I just love this picture. This is one of the nephews of one of the team members that we had, who brought her nephew to the day, and just reminds me of how important it is to have that intergenerational learning. And it reminds us of why we do what we do. It's for the young ones. For this young fella here, he will be inheriting what we leave behind. When we talk about working on the land, and we talk about building community with youth, it's about creating relationships. And so a lot of what we did was teaching through doing, which is Indigenous pedagogy. And so we did some weaving, some Salish weaving right from the beginning of the process, with carding all the way to spinning, and then into weaving. We wove wool headbands. We also did lots of arts-based activities that were supported by one of our youth leaders, Jessica Joseph. Restoration was a key theme over the summer. So we took a couple of trips to different locations that were heavily impacted by the heat dome. And so this is out at Pockwitchin, out in Coles Bay. And here we're looking at oysters that literally baked in their shells. And that event actually coincided with record low temperature, record low tides. And so there was actually no safety, no haven for any of the shellfish, and they lost about 95% of the shellfish in this area, which was once rich with shellfish. Here we're doing a project at UVic, restoring a field of invasive grasses to plant camas, one of the indigenous plants to this territory that is culturally and spiritually significant to the people of Lekwungen and to my people in Snuneymuxw as well. So we spent a few days here at the site smothering the grasses and going over with mulch, and then we came back later in the late fall to plant camas in this area that had been prepared in a different way than normally it would be. Traditionally, we would prepare the land for camas through burning, and that's something we're exploring doing at different locations, but it's logistically very challenging with fire permits and different things. So it's just a short video clip of us doing some of the work, laying down the cardboard, and then the mulch over top of that, eventually to go over with soil to plant the camas. And the camas plot's doing really well now. We're hoping it's a small area for now. We're hoping to use it to propagate more camas to eventually restore this entire area. One of the important things that we did over the summer, we went to Tlaches, which is an island just off of the main island. These belong to Songhees Nation, and they are relatively untouched by any development. And so the islands are very much in a natural state. And so you can see here at the top left, this is Elder Sethlamat, or Joan Morris. She came with us on our trips because she actually spent the first 10 years of her life growing up on Tlaches. And so she shares some of the stories of growing up there and what it was like. She called it a heaven on earth. The island was home to about 500 people at least. There's 5 or 6 giant longhouses, the remains of which you can see in this picture down in the middle right. We're all spread around, but each one housed about 100 people, and it was likely a winter village site. We spent some time with archaeologist Darcy Matthews from the University of Victoria, who shared some of the archaeology of the area that he had been doing, and we actually got to do some excavations with the youth. It was really powerful for those youth to be able to learn the true history of their land and their territory from what the land and the archaeology was telling them, not from what the textbooks or the history books were telling them. Throughout the program, it was so important that we have elder involvement and knowledge holder involvement. We had local nation involvement. This is the boat from Songhees Nation that helped transport us over. And here we are here listening to sounds underneath the water with the hydrophone. So really braiding Western science with Indigenous science was a key component of the work we were trying to accomplish. To enable the youth to walk into worlds, to have the ability to, walk into a science lab and have the abilities there, but also to walk into their communities with traditional knowledge systems. This is Goldstream Park, and we spent some time here as well. It's quite a large park, and it's one of the few areas where salmon still spawn in Victoria due to urbanization and habitat loss. And so while we spent some time there, we caught some trout and looked at the different species of trout and salmon that were in the river. And the picture down on the bottom right, I just want you to have a look at. This is one I was actually here at Goldstream a few weeks later. So we were there in August originally with this group, and then I was there with another class of students in November after the heavy rains came. And I took a picture of this because I thought it was such an interesting juxtaposition. It says on this sign, I don't know if you can see it, but the sign says stream bank restoration in progress. Please stay on the path. And then if you see, this is the path here, it's completely washed out and unrecognizable. And it was really interesting for me having that experience. It was a surreal experience just being there a couple of months ago and how vibrant the area was. And then after the floods came, it was a massive flood. There were salmon, actually spawning salmon, swimming in between the picnic tables about 50 meters up from the river itself. I know many of you have probably seen pictures and video of similar scenes along the west coast and around the Salish Sea of salmon swimming along highways and roads. Well, this was just our experience, our local experience with that. And I'm, it was really devastating. It was a real teachable moment. I was able to share, about the impacts that we're having on our environment through this opportunity. But it was also kind of bittersweet I spent a lot of time in Goldstream Park and I live right near it. So, to see the devastation of the area and, we don't even know what the salmon stocks will be doing in 4 years from now, having been completely washed out. An important part of the work that I do is around youth voice and elevating youth voice. So these are two of the youth leaders that we worked with over the summer. These two, Jessica Joseph and Frankie Taylor, actually co-presented with me in a youth panel at the conference that we did in October. And part of the work that Frankie has done recently was to compile some of the experiences of the summer opportunities. So she put together a report to go out to community to report back on the success of the program. So I just wanted to quickly link to that and just show you how impactful that was. Living Labs is a collaborative initiative between some of Victoria's First Nations communities, youth, local schools, and the University of Victoria. It was created to engage our communities in networking and coming together as one to learn about things such as restoration, maintaining our ecosystems, our history as First Nations people, the biology of our lands, waters, and so much more. Living Labs not only given us space where we can come together and network, but it has brought us together as a community, as a whole community. And then it just goes in to talk about some of the experiences and how impactful those were. I know I'm running short on time and I'm actually over time, so I would have liked to spend a little bit more time on that, but maybe I can make that resource available for people who are interested. So the idea of Natsamat, we are all one. The understanding that all things are connected and thus interact with one another and even have spiritual significance or consequences is central to Salish cosmology, which maintains that the realm of human experience exists alongside of spiritual or supernatural worlds. Relationality is a serious responsibility. It means that we are accountable to the communities that we work in and with, and the people, creatures, land, and spiritual entities of the territories that we are on. We must begin all of our work by building relationships. If our work brings us into an Indigenous community, relationships become even more significant. We cannot exploit folks by wanting their knowledge, but not being willing to spend the time necessary to build relationships. Relationship building is the beginning of what makes our work rooted in traditional ways of knowing and being. I want to say Heit Sapka, thank you all. It's so very great to be here. I'm going to get into the questions. Half an hour goes by so fast. So hopefully I was able to get everything articulated that I wanted to. I could have probably used another 20 minutes or so, but I won't be I won't be too picky. So one of the questions that was sent to me that was submitted before in registration for this event was, what are some good ways to incorporate Indigenous knowledge and wisdom into our collective efforts to deal with climate change? Well, that's a really great question. I could spend, another 20 minutes just on this alone, but I'm thinking about, the most impactful thing that people can do as a group is really empower Indigenous communities to take those leadership steps. You know, in my position, I see a lot of tokenism. I see they like to have Indigenous community members at the beginning of an event doing a territorial acknowledgement or a welcome, and that's the end of their involvement in that event. Or they'll like to have a First Nations drumming and singing group at an event, but that will be the extent of it. Well, I challenge everybody here today to take steps to empower their local community leaders, their local nations, to be the drivers of change when it comes to dealing with climate change. How are cultural values being passed to the next generation in your community? Well, I think I touched on that a little bit in this presentation. For me, it was really growing up with my family, my parents, my grandparents, spending lots of time with elders. When I was young and we'd go fishing up in Patchedat territory on the Nitnat River, we would always stop by an elder's house, JP Jones, and we would always visit for hours. And we would ask him if he needed any fish because we were going to the river, and he would share where the fish were, the best way to catch them. And that was much of how I grew up, spending time in community and with elders. And so we tried to bring a lot of that with us to the program and to the work that we do, is bridging that generational divide and getting the youth and the elders together on the land is so very valuable and powerful and impactful. What are the best ways to empower people to understand how interconnected we all are, and thus your actions make an immeasurable difference? Well, I think the best way to describe it, like I've tried to explain here today, is not so much, is we are all one. If you view the trees in your yard, or the salmon swimming in the river, or the whales swimming up the channel, or the eagles flying in the sky, if you view all things like they are your relatives, you are less likely to do things that will impact them adversely. And really, when we think of the term all my relations, it really means all are related, that we are all one. And so the best way to empower people to understand how interconnected we all are is to stress that the health of our ecosystem reflects our health as well. I spend a lot of time taking students on the land to do land-based activities, and one of them I love to do is clam digging. I love to take students clam digging. I actually have to take students about 40 kilometers north of Victoria now to harvest safely. For you Americans, that's about 25 miles. And when I go to look on my digital map of where is safe to harvest, all reserve lands are always closed for sanitary closures. And so it really speaks to the impact that our Homok people, our First Nations people, can't even harvest in their own lands. But I know we want to have some more time for other questions, and so I'll just open it up here before getting too deep into that.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation, and thanks for already getting into the questions. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So we've had a few questions come in, and I'm sure it's been hard to see the chat as you've been talking. So I'll just try to communicate those to you and see if we can get through a few here in the next 10 minutes or so. One thing I just noticed come through was a question about the border and wondering about Indigenous nations connecting across the border. And also, I'm curious if you could speak to the broader context of how the border has affected cultural practice and connection between communities in this region.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I think it's impacted our communities tremendously. I mean, the border is an imaginary line, and actually, you know, what's interesting is that Victoria is actually south of that border. So if we looked at the 49th parallel as the border, Victoria is actually about 50 kilometers south of that. So I remember hearing historically that, you know, America originally wanted to have this area be part of America when that border was established. But when I think about community and local communities, you know, the Saanich nations on the southernmost peninsula are actually much closer in kinship and culturally to the Western Washington nations than like even my nation, Snuneymuxw. You know, I talk to lots of elders, you know, when we're out on the land or on the water, and they'll say, you know, on when the tides were just right, you know, they could ride a canoe all the way from Saanich territory all the way down into Western Washington state and the Southern Gulf Islands without a single paddle stroke. And so it was just like a highway. You would just ride your canoe all the way to your family on the other side of the water and back and forth following the tides with minimal effort. You know, from all accounts that I've heard, you know, Coast Salish people were master seamen, really knew every element of the ocean and tides and how to navigate and get from, you know, place to place in such an efficient way. And so having that artificial border, you know, has really impacted the ability to come and go the way that, you know, that we used to. You know, Coast Salish people are saltwater people. You know, we live, you know, the ocean runs through our blood. And so we, you know, spend lots of time out on the water, you know, navigating or harvesting. You know, for me growing up, we spent a lot of time down in Washington State as well. I know that we have the J Treaty, which is in place to limit some of the limitations from having that border. So we're supposed to have like federally protected rights to come and go freely through the J Treaty if we are from these territories.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really helpful. There was some interest in the Tlaches example that you provided, and I wanted to quickly name that Darcy Matthews spoke in this series last winter and spoke about that project and Satlamat's knowledge and sharing there. So that's something that students might want to look at. And particularly Darcy was talking about soil science and some of the ways that they're doing that braiding of Indigenous science and Western science through that project. And I was wondering if we could kind of touch on that theme by asking you to comment more on what that braiding has looked like in practice. You provided a few examples, and I'm just wondering if there are any highlights that you've noticed for moving towards a Natsamat approach in these collaboration projects, a way to move towards that in the collaboration work without appropriating that for those folks who are coming maybe from the Western sciences or from non-Indigenous spaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, it's tough because in education, I think that, you know, local communities are inundated with requests from people doing, you know, their graduate degrees, you know, masters or PhDs, you know, wanting to do research. I hear from a lot of community members that, you know, Indigenous people are the most researched people in Canada, and that's true. You know, and so when we talk about research, we talk about experiences and cultural knowledge. We think about, you know, community intellectual property. There is a fine line there between what is, you know, exploitative, what is extractive. You know, we think about, I've heard the term, the colonization of Indigenous knowledge, you know, is a new kind of concept where you know, Indigenous communities are being tapped into for their knowledge and understanding and expertise, but the reciprocity isn't there. And so at the beginning of my talk, I really wanted to stress the importance of relationships, of relationality. You know, I can go to an elder from this territory and ask for support in a program like this because I've spent my life here and built those relationships, you know, and have, you know, put in that time and also given back. Reciprocity is such a key piece. And so when we talk about reciprocity with students, I'll take them out clam digging, and we'll take the clams and we'll give them to elders in the community as an act of reciprocity, as a way of giving back, and for sharing their cultural knowledge and their teachings with us. And so I think, in short, I would say that accountability is paramount. As Indigenous people and as Indigenous educators in the community, we have a layer of accountability that I don't think many other people in a university setting necessarily feel if they're not part of the Indigenous community. If we say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, the community will hold us accountable for that. They'll say, why did you do that? Or why did you say that? And so if, you know, for Darcy as an example, Darcy has spent that time and built that relationship and has that accountability. And he does his work in a good way, you know, in a Ait Squalin way. You reference the teaching of Ait Squalin, which is a good mind and a good heart, you know, that really speaks more to just, you know, doing things in a good way. It's the interconnectedness of everything that we do and how that impacts the people that we work with. And so, you know, I'd like to think of Ait Squalin and Natsamat as guiding teachings, guiding principles when we're doing this work in community in a good way. And that's for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike. So.
Thank you. Thanks. And there's so many more questions than we'll get to in the next few minutes, but something you said is a nice segue to one that came through about how universities can support Indigenous students, to invite, encourage, retain Indigenous students in university spaces on our campuses in the region.
Yeah, that's a really great question too. I think that having programs that are flexible for the needs of the community are key. You know, myself going through school and seeing lots of other Indigenous students going through school, there's so many challenges and pressures put on those students, you know, who are oftentimes young parents who may need support with childcare or other, you know, financial support. As you know, working in education for many years, I've seen a huge need for Indigenous educators, you know, for teachers, for professors. There's just not that many out there. And so there's a huge gap there. And a lot of the time when I'm supporting professional learning for teachers around our school district, oftentimes it'll be a room of non-Indigenous teachers. And that's okay. And what I tell them is that, you know, you don't have to be Indigenous to hold space for Indigenous students to show their leadership and to take leadership on these projects and initiatives. And I use the example of when I was going through school myself. When I was in high school, I was in a class. It was one of the first years they taught it, and it was First Nations Community Studies. It was, or BC First Nations Studies rather. And it was actually taught by a self-proclaimed white guy from California. You know, Mr. Waterlander, and he would say, yeah, you know, I'm just a white guy from California, but, you know, if I can help you with some understanding and, you know, provide opportunity and space for you to express yourself, then I think I've done my job. And that's exactly what he did. He provided, you know, produced an environment that was, I think, culturally safe, where we were safe to express ourselves. And I think there was about 5 Indigenous students in there, and the rest were non-Indigenous. And he really shaped my trajectory. And I think originally I wanted to go into law, and after that experience and being able to speak my truth in a space that was valued and acknowledged for what it was, really empowered me as a young person, and really shaped my trajectory into education. So I like to tell teachers that story, particularly non-Indigenous teachers, because you don't always realize how impactful you can be. You know, it's not always about leading the work, it's about holding space for your Indigenous students that's safe, that's you know, that's acknowledging, that's valuing.
Great, thank you so much. We're at time, but is there anything else you'd like to end with, or you wanted to mention? Any suggestions for further learning for the people joining us today?
Yeah, I think my final thought would just be to listen, to truly listen. Sometimes we listen with our heads, you know, we listen with our minds, but we don't always listen with our hearts. I spent a lot of time, you know, growing up listening to elders, a lot of time with elders and knowledge holders. You know, my dad was the off-reserve liaison for our nation when we were going through treaty negotiations, and I would just sit as a, you know, 8-year-old, 10-year-old boy listening to the elders from our community, to our chief and council, to the lawyers, and listen to them negotiate with the federal and provincial government negotiators, and I would just spend time listening. And I think that's what's given me the right to speak up now, is because I've spent my entire life listening. And what I will leave you with that final thought, and what elders will, the first thing they'll say is to please listen.
Thank you so much. Thank you for letting us listen to you today and for sharing with us. And there's lots and lots of thank yous coming through in the chat. So I hope you'll take a moment to take a look at those. And we really appreciate you making time to join us today. Thanks very much. And for all of us here in the room, let's give a round of applause.
It's Apka. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you very much.